Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good, okay. Thank you all for coming out tonight. So what I want to talk about is Postcapitalist Temporalities, which is this sort of idea about what does the future mean today. And I'm going to try to make this as sort of accessible as possible. Whenever you're talking about time, it's always something which is quite hard to grasp onto. It's the famous quote of, I know exactly what time is until somebody asks me what it is. And it just sort of slips between your fingers. I'm going to try to make it quite accessible, though. Hopefully that works. So I'll begin with this idea of no future, which is what I think our sort of contemporary condition is. So we have a world that changes rapidly, but we seem to have lost any idea of a future. So we have geopolitical turmoil all over the world, whether it be Syria, Russia, China, everywhere. We have fleeting cultural microgenres, which seem to pop up every year and disappear just as quickly. And then we have rapidly changing technologies. It seems like every aspect of our everyday life seems to be passing by increasingly quickly. And it seems like, in some sense, the radically new is just over the horizon. But at the same time, we also have this deeply ingrained sense that world history has ended and that capitalism has won. Now, this doesn't mean that things won't change, but the fundamental parameters of our contemporary world seem to have solidified and don't seem to be on the verge of changing in any way. So we seem to have solidified into liberal democracies as the endpoint of history, individual human rights, and global capitalism as the way in which we fundamentally organize our societies. Now this is the famous sort of thesis put forth by Francis Fukuyama after the end of the Cold War. He argued, we've reached the end of history. And again, this doesn't mean that things don't change, but the fundamental coordinates of our social reality are going to stay the same. So they come to appear as eternal elements rather than historical, temporary, constructed sort of elements. Now the right celebrates this. The right says, well, this is great. We've reached the final endpoint of history, liberal democracy, global capitalism. This is fantastic. And on the left, you have people falling into melancholy and defeat. So sort of famously, Franco Berardi, who's a massive depressive, basically just sad about the world constantly. He's written this book. It's a fantastic book, After the Future. I highly recommend it. But the future for him is over with. And you have the Invisible Committee, a French communization group, which has a nice little quote that says, "The future has no future." And then you have Simon Critchley, who says that we have to resist the idea and ideology of the future. And for him, any notion of the future is itself a sort of capitalist mystification. So we can't talk about the future for Simon Critchley at all. So that we have on the right, we have celebration of this, and on the left, we have melancholy and defeat. Now, the main question I want to talk about today is, what does it mean to think a future from within late capitalism? What does it mean, taking these conditions into account, to think the future today? Now, I want to begin by distinguishing two different categories. And these will sort of play into everything that I talk about today. So two different senses of time. One is a phenomenological sense of a rapidly changing world. So this is what we feel in everyday life when we look around us, how the world appears to us. Things are constantly changing, it seems like. New technologies, new jobs, new wars, new conflicts, new problems. But this is contrasted with a historical sense of time. And the historical sense is that actually time has stopped. History has fundamentally stopped. So I want to sort of draw a distinction between these two, because this is one of the fundamental tensions that are important to understanding what it means to think the future today. So those are two categories I want to work with. Now there's two further categories which are also important. And this comes from the German historian Reinhard Koselleck's work, who has some fantastic work, and I highly recommend it. I don't see too many people discussing him, but he has some really interesting ideas. You can sort of imagine him as a Kantian take on the nature of history. And so he sort of looks at what are the formal conditions for thinking history in any sense at all. And he has two categories that he thinks are the formal conditions. So the first one is the space of experience. And this is essentially the incorporation of the past into the present to make sense of the present moment. He then talks about the horizon of expectation, which is the future essentially experienced as a repository of different expectations. What do we think is going to happen in the future? And basically, with these two categories, you can look back over history and sort of see exactly how our understanding of time and history has changed in the course of time. So I want to use these two concepts to sort of think about what it means to think the future today. And sort of playing on this idea of the horizon of expectation, returning to Berardi, he says the future is not a natural dimension of the mind. It is a modality of projection and imagination, a feature of expectation and attention, and its modalities and features change with the changing of cultures. So basically, we have to get rid of this idea that there is one single future. The future is itself socially constructed, and we have to sort of take this into account. So let me give one example. The pre-modern era. So for the pre-modern era, experience essentially aligns with expectations. So there's a close relationship between the two. So if you look at sort of everyday life in the pre-modern era, it's regulated by cycles. So there's a circular notion of time going on. So you can think about, for instance, you plant crops at one point in the year, you harvest crops at another point in the year. You have sort of weekly cycles, whether it be the Sabbath, these sorts of things. But everything about everyday life is organized in terms of a predictable sequence of cycles. So your expectations align with your experience of the world. So this is essentially what the pre-modern era is all about. There's a close relationship between these two different categories. And this is on a phenomenological level. Now, if we look at a broader sort of historical level within the pre-modern era, it's oriented towards a sort of eschatological endpoint. It's this idea that there's some sort of apocalypse, whether it be a redemption at the very end or whether it be some sort of traumatic experience at the end. The idea is that historical time itself is oriented towards some sort of apocalyptic endpoint. And this is an idea that is very much enforced by the church. And the church's notions of time are seen to be coexistent with everything that exists in the world. So the punishment, if you sort of went against this eschatological idea of time, was to be burned at the stake and these sorts of things. You'd be executed for it. So the church really enforced this sort of idea, but this is how history is oriented. It's towards this apocalyptic endpoint. So that's sort of the pre-modern era. And eventually this all breaks down, and we come to the modern era, which is when we have the disruption and the domestication of the future. So with modernity, we get a new image of time, a new image of historical time in particular. So the idea is that the future is not about the end times anymore. It's not the repository of some sort of apocalyptic image. Instead, the future is about progress. The future is going to be different and it's going to be better. Now, this means that you have a separation then between experience of the present moment and your expectations of the future. Your expectations of the future are suddenly disruptive. They no longer make sense of what exactly is going on in the everyday world. You can expect things to be constantly disrupted. So Marx's famous quote about all that is solid melts into air, for instance. It's this idea that everything you everything that you experience, all that past accumulation of knowledge is going to be constantly disrupted. So the modern era is effectively sort of characterized by this disjuncture. So you can think about technological changes, things like the Industrial Revolution, but also political changes. It's the era of revolutions. The sort of old traditional feudal orders are all breaking down. The bourgeoisie is rising up and taking over. Capitalism is emerging. all these old truths which made sense of the world no longer hold. And so the future is going to be different. Now this is a sort of disruptive moment of modernity. The idea that things are going to be different. But it then gets re-domesticated. And I want to argue that it gets domesticated in terms of narratives of progress. And this is actually a way to sort of reincorporate the future back into something which is intelligible. So narratives of progress are obviously something that emerges at this time. Philosophically, we can sort of think of Hegel's system as the most sophisticated version of this. So this idea that actually the entirety of history is a progression towards absolute knowledge. Likewise, Marx takes the same sort of idea and says, well, all of history is about the interplay between productive forces and class struggle, and it's all tending towards a communist utopia. So again, there's this idea of progress. Now, this is all linked in with two other aspects. One is Eurocentrism. So these images of progress are all being constructed within Europe. Europe takes itself to be the leading light of the world, and then projects its image of the future onto everybody else. It becomes the sole model for exactly what the world should be like, and how society should be organized. And then finally, we have capitalism. Capitalism becomes the sort of endpoint of every image of progress. This idea that even in Marx, you have to pass through capitalism. You can't sort of escape it. But capitalism is the way forward to escape from traditional societies, feudal economic orders, these sorts of things. So this is, I think, a sort of domestication of that initial disruptive moment of modernity. So the point where expectations separated from experience initially now becomes reconnected within an image of a future which allows you to make sense of where you are in the world. You can start to say, okay, well, I am at the leading edge of world history, or I'm in a backward society. You can somehow orient yourself within the rest of history. So this is the domestication of modernity. But now we come to the end of progress, and this is sort of the postmodern moment. So this starts to happen the 1950s onwards. Ideas of progress get increasingly criticized. This is on both a philosophical level, but also a political level as well. So on a philosophical level, after World War II, it sort of appeared that, well, the archetype of modern society had led to the Holocaust. And it sort of seemed like something had gone tragically wrong here for modernity and images of progress to lead to something so traumatic. So philosophy starts to reflect upon what exactly was it in these ideas of progress, the idea of modernity, which enabled something like the Holocaust to emerge. And so you start to have criticisms of all of this. And the idea starts to become, well, progress itself doesn't actually exist. So if you start to think about Francois Lyotard as one of the most obvious examples of this, Lyotard argues for the end of meta-narratives, which is essentially for the end of any idea of progress. The idea is that all these stories that we were telling about ourselves, about history, about progress, they're all illusions for Lyotard. And postmodernity for him is the recognition of this, is to look back and to critically self-reflect and say, actually, this is all entirely wrong. There is no such thing as progress. There are no meta-narratives to history. Now, Walter Benjamin argues for a very similar sort of thing. So he has this sort of idea of the angel of history being swept forward. But it's not swept forward and facing forward. It's swept forward and facing backwards towards the past. And it's focused upon the catastrophes that have been accumulating in the past, rather than having some sort of image of the future. So Walter Benjamin is again sort of getting rid of any idea of a sort of grand historical project. So for him, there's only this movement away from the past, not necessarily towards a better future. And then finally, one other example is Jacques Derrida's work. So he argues that there actually can be nothing to look forward to, except the very act of looking forward itself. So this is the act of expecting as a sort of formal condition of temporality. So his argument is, well, there is possibly some sort of unforeseeable point at which the future may arrive, but it's always unpredictable, always unforeseeable. We can never sort of domesticate it into any sort of image of progress. So there's this rupture to come, this possible future to come, and it's just a sort of minimal idea of the future. There's no content to it. So I think what you get from these sort of philosophical critiques of the idea of progress is again a maintenance of the idea of a direction to history. There's still a sense in which we're moving forward, but there's no teleology, there's no necessity to it, and there's definitely no image of progress involved in this. We're moving forward, but not necessarily towards anything better. And effectively, particularly I think in Derrida's work, the image of the future itself becomes contentless. It becomes empty. There's just this sort of formal condition for what the future could be, but there's no content at all to what it actually is. So this is the sort of postmodern, post-structuralist moment, critiquing images of progress and saying that this stuff is basically an illusion. So that's the philosophical side. Now politically as well, we have people in practice criticizing ideas of progress, particularly Eurocentric ideas of progress, sort of highlighting that, well, these are Eurocentric rather, Eurocentric and parochial sort of images of progress. So in one case, you have economists starting to question the idea of underdevelopment. So in the traditional approach of modernity, you had sort of backward societies and then you had advanced societies, and everybody sort of followed upon a linear pathway towards the advanced societies. Now you start to have people question this, and they say, well, actually, underdevelopment in many cases is actively constructed by capitalism. Underdevelopment is actively constructed by capitalism as a way to maintain certain countries and certain regions of the world in sort of conditions of oppression, conditions of cheap labor, conditions of exploitation. And so underdevelopment is suddenly no longer a backward stage of history. Instead, it's a simultaneous moment of capitalism. So you have economists starting to question this idea about progress and a linear notion of progress. Now, likewise, you have the whole entire decolonization movement suggesting that, well, actually, we don't want to follow in the footsteps of Europe. We want to actively create our own future. And so what's happening here politically is that a singular image of progress, the European image of progress, starts to fragment into multiple images of what the future might be, what it could be. So I think politically you're not seeing a sort of expulsion of any content of the future like you see philosophically, but you're seeing a sort of pluralization of different images of the future at this point. But I think sort of united, they both give up on any sort of universal idea of progress. Both philosophically and politically, they suggest that the idea of meta-narratives is completely wrong. The idea of sort of universal progress is completely wrong as well. But I think there's a problem with that. And the problem is, well, capitalism has won. We live in a world where capitalism has now expanded itself around the world. It's infiltrated itself into every single aspect of our lives. And there doesn't seem to be any sort of counterbalance against it at all. So I think what you see here is that despite the sort of critiques of a single image of progress, every society in the world has tended towards capitalism, has become capitalist. And so it seems like in practice, there actually is a universal endpoint to history, an empirical endpoint that suggests that everything tends towards capitalism. And I think that this is a sort of problem that has to be faced up to by postmodernity, by post-structuralism, by any sort of images, any sort of critics of progress, is to say, well, actually, we do have this meta-narrative that exists. So let me talk now about capitalist progress. What does it mean to talk about capitalism as having won? Capitalism as being a sort of meta-narrative. I think on one hand, it's a mistake to sort of equate capitalism with modernity. So if you remember, modernity was all about the separation of expectation from experience, a sort of disruption, the idea that the future was going to be different and better. I don't think the capitalist image of progress in history is like that. So capitalist temporality is different. And I want to argue that in capitalism, you don't have an image of progress. But it's also not like the pre-modern era. You don't have a sort of eschatological image of the future. Instead, effectively, the future has been canceled within capitalism. And instead, I think it's better characterized by a sort of eternal present. So we can think about this as sort of a reduction of expectations into the realm of experience. And this is, I think, Friedrich Jameson's famous quote. I think this is the meaning of Friedrich Jameson's quote here. So he says, "It has become easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And the point here is not to say that our future is apocalyptically oriented, but instead to say that it's easier to imagine the end of the world rather than any sort of escape from our eternal present of capitalism. So it's not about apocalypse at all. It's just about this eternal present, the fact that we can't think of future whatsoever. So this is, I think, the time of late capitalism, the temporality of capitalism. It's not the time of modernity. It's not the time of pre-modernity, but it's also not the time of post-modernity. It's something unique. It's something different. It's the eternal present. Now, what do I mean by the eternal present? What characterizes the capitalist eternal present? Or effectively, what is sort of repeated throughout all the variations that we see within capitalism? Well, the basic sort of repetitive structure of capitalism is the one that Marx pointed out long ago, which is M to C to M prime. So what does this mean? Well, you imagine the capitalist has a whole bunch of money, so that's M, basically goes out and buys means of production, natural resources, land, commodities, and labor, puts them all together, builds a factory, produces surplus value, sells all its goods, and at the end of the process, gets more value back than what the capitalist initially put in. So M to C to prime is effectively the process of valorization. It's the process of making a profit. And this is the fundamental structure of capitalism. It's this aspect that you see in every single variation of capitalism. It's what makes capitalism capitalism. And this is the eternal present. So we can see numerous variations of capitalism. Anything is allowed so long as it doesn't break this cycle. And so this is the eternal present of capitalism, is the repetition again and again and again of this cycle. So I think what it means to then think a sort of post-capitalist future is to break past this cycle, to get away from it, to somehow break it down. So this is what I want to talk about to sort of conclude. Post-capitalist temporalities. If our present era is sort of characterized by the eternal present of capitalism, what does it mean to think a post-capitalist temporality today? The argument I want to make is that there's three sorts of conditions for thinking the future in a post-capitalist way today. So the three sorts of conditions. One is we have to reject the inevitability of progress. So we have to take on board the critiques made of progress within the 20th century. We have to, secondly, reject a transcendent perspective on history. So the sort of idea that we could stand outside of history and see all of it and how it was supposed to proceed, we have to give up on that idea. And then finally, we have to break through the eternal present. We have to break past capitalist accumulation. So the three aspects on the left-hand side are the sort of negative conditions for thinking post-capitalist temporality today. Now on the right-hand side, we can put it in more positive terms. So I want to argue that a post-capitalist temporality today has to be hyperstational, it has to be navigational, and it has to be about acceleration. So I'll go through exactly what I mean by these. So the first of these is hyperstation. So the future must be understood as a hyperstation. And this effectively means the future is not something to be waited for, let alone something that will emerge necessarily in time. It's not something that is passively received. Instead, Hyperstation points to the fact that the future is an active force within the present. It's actively trying to bring itself about. And famously, when people talk about Hyperstation, this comes from CCRU back in the 90s. They always reference Terminator. And this is sort of the best diagram I could find of it. Somebody tried to figure out exactly the narrative, temporal narrative of all the Terminator movies and put them into one diagram. So this is Hyperstation itself here. So Hyperstation is a matter of the future coming into the present and actively trying to bring itself about. It's not a passive waiting for the future to occur. So I think effectively what Hyperstation points to is the force of the future, the force of time. It's effectively what propels us forward. So if we think about something like Benjamin's work, the idea was, for him, the angel of history was being propelled forward, but it was being propelled forward by a storm. It was being propelled forward by this natural force, which is just completely sort of inevitable. Humans have no control over it. There's no sort of active agency involved. It's just historical necessity that the angel of history is thrown forward into time. Now, Hyperstation is different from that. Hyperstation says, well, again, we have to be active. We have to sort of think about constructing the future in the present and use it as a sort of a way of mobilizing different forces together into a world historical force today. Okay, so Hyperstation sort of rejects any idea of a necessary future. And it takes the form grammatically of a what will have been. And I wanted to type this out because I think this is quite it takes a bit to wrap your head around. But effectively, the present is posited as the past of a future present. This is a sort of formal idea of what Hyperstation is. So it's a what will have been. And this is what Hyperstation is all about. So progress is no longer inevitable. And I also want to sort of contrast it with Derrida's idea of the future to come. So for Derrida, again, it was a purely sort of formal thing. There was no content to the future. To put any content to it was to ruin exactly what he was talking about. Now, Hyperstation is different because Hyperstation does ascribe a minimal content to what the future means. And in this sense, Hyperstation has a sort of latent utopianism to it. It can dream of a better future, it can dream of a better world, and it can sort of put this into motion in the present. So I think it's usefully contrasted with Derrida's idea of the future as well. Now, that being said, it's a sort of minimal content in Hyperstation. So it's not a blueprint, which would be to return towards a sort of absolute knowledge idea or the sort of classic Marxist idea that the sort of success of full communism is inevitable. Those things also have to be given up on. We can't have a blueprint of the future, but we also can't have a sort of minimal formal idea of the future. And I think Hyperstation sort of gets at the medium ground between those two. But now, if we don't have a blueprint for the future, if we don't have an absolute perspective on history, this means we have to work from within history. And this is the second sort of characteristic of post-capitalist temporalities, which is navigation. Now, the best way I've sort of found to describe what I mean by navigation is a sort of spatial analogy. So I want to talk about the Micronesian islands, which is sort of odd to bring up for post-capitalist temporalities, but it turns out it's really fascinating. So this is the Micronesian islands here. It is an area where land takes up less than 1% of the area. So very, very tiny islands separated by massive expanses of land. And none of these islands are very tall. So this is another thing. You don't see them over the horizon. When you're off in the middle of the water, you basically just see water everywhere. You don't see the islands in between. Now, the fascinating thing is that the people who live here can navigate without GPS, without anything, without being able to see an island over the horizon. They can somehow make it between all of these different islands and do so very successfully, which is, when you think about it, a matter of life and death. If you're a couple degrees off, when you set off from one island to another, you're going to end up traveling off into the middle of the ocean and you'll perish. So somehow these people have developed a system of navigation which enables them to get to all these different places without being able to see over the horizon. And now I want to suggest that this is a sort of immanent perspective of navigation, a sort of way that we can think about getting through history without relying upon an absolute perspective. So let me contrast this with more traditional images of navigation. So if you think about how we all get around today, you hop out of the tube, you wonder where to go, you pull out your phone, you've got GPS, you've got a compass, you've got all of these things which enable you to pinpoint exactly where you are on an absolute grid. You've got fixed reference points, you've got absolute directions, northeast, southwest, and you can figure out exactly where you are and where you're supposed to be going very easily with modern technology. Now this is all premised upon a transcendent perspective on navigation. So you think, for instance, somebody standing over top of a map is quite literally what a transcendent perspective on history is all about. Somebody looking down and charting out exactly where you're going to go, what you need to avoid, how long it's going to take, all of these sorts of things. So this is the traditional way that we in the Western world think of navigation. So there's a book by Edwin Hutchins who talks about how people navigate. And so he says, describing the Western way of navigation, every location can be assigned an absolute address in a global coordinate system. Direction, position, and distance are all defined in terms of a single universal framework, established by applying a scheme of angular measurement to the Earth itself. A universal time standard, in combination with the measurement of distance, yields a universal rate of movement. So again, there's all these ideas about there's a universal framework for navigation, there's fixed points, there's absolute coordinates, and this applies to everybody. And this is effectively the sort of absolute image of history. If we transpose this sort of spatial idea into time, this is the absolute idea of history. Now, in the Micronesian form of navigation, it's quite different. So this is one of the tools that they use. I'll describe it in a second. Now, how do the Micronesians navigate around these islands? Well, they only have the localized perspective. So you set off in a canoe from one island to another. You have the localized perspective. And until recently, you didn't have GPS. You didn't have overhead maps or anything like this. So you've got a canoe, and then you've got just ocean as far as the eye can see in every single direction. Now, the interesting part here is that when they travel, the voyage itself can't be fully determined in advance. It can't be determined from the land, but instead, it has to be navigated as they're going through the course of the voyage itself. So it's constantly changing, they're constantly adapting, they're constantly sort of responding to changing signs around them in order to make it to their endpoint. So this is effectively, I think, the sort of the immanent aspect of a history of time, a theory of time. Is the idea that, again, they don't have any absolute perspective. They're just there within the moment, trying to make sense of exactly where they're going. So this is effectively what they're working with. Now this tool here is a tool where the sort of straight up and down and the horizontal lines are just there to hold the piece together. The curved lines are wave swells, which are one of the ways in which they start to reference exactly where they are in terms of the voyage. So how do they actually travel around? You're in a canoe, you see ocean everywhere. How do you actually move around? Well, in the first case, it's navigation by dead reckoning. So dead reckoning is effectively, your location is determined by knowing your previous location, so where you were at one point, and then the time and direction that you've traveled since then. So this is a good example of it here. You can, from these two things, you can have a basic sense of exactly how far you've traveled, where you've traveled to, and this is the sort of fundamental aspect of how they navigate across the ocean. Now, how else do they get across? Well, one problem here is how do you determine distances and orientations when you don't have a map, when you don't have any sort of transcendent perspective? Well, they develop their own sort of coordinate systems. So they use a couple of different things. There's no fixed points of reference. There's no universal absolute coordinate system. But instead, you have a number of different mobile coordinate systems. So the most obvious case here is the trajectory of stars over the night sky. You can use these to gain some sort of bearing upon where you're going, even if you can't see anything over the horizon. So they use this mobile trajectory of the stars to gain some sort of bearing about where they are. Now the other aspect is, well, they use ocean swells. So the actual wave patterns within the ocean have a distinct repetitive pattern. And so once you get to know these, and again, this is what this was all about, you would get to know the wave patterns, and this would give you a sense of exactly where you are. Another thing is they would learn these sorts of things on the land. This would be a tool to teach children about the wave patterns. And then you would just leave this sort of tool at home. You wouldn't bring it with you on the voyage. But so you've got wave patterns, you've got the mobile patterns of the stars, and then you've also got some other things. So things like they actually sort of create virtual islands in their heads to sort of mark off progress. And this is another way of sort of coordinating exactly where they are, how far they've traveled, what they should be expecting to see, have they gone off course, all of these sorts of things. Yep. Okay, good. So there's also a number of different aspects that when they're nearing the end of the voyage, as you get closer to the island that you're trying to head towards, you start to see other sort of indicators that you're nearing the end of your voyage. So things like seagulls start to appear. The wave patterns take on an even more distinctive pattern. All of this sort of suggests you're getting close to the end point. So I think this is all quite interesting. Is that, again, none of these coordinates are static. And none of them are universal either. They're all localized. They depend on exactly where you're going, which part of the voyage you're in. And all these sorts of things have to be memorized so you can take it with you on the voyage. So let me give a quick summary of navigation. One is, I think the Micronesian idea of it provides a sort of imminent perspective of what navigation might mean. It relies upon a dynamic set of coordinates for guidance rather than a universal or a fixed set. And there's an all-encompassing horizon in which the endpoint recedes, yet it still orients present actions. And finally, the endpoint remains a posited and abstract coordinate to render our current actions intelligible. And I think this corresponds to sort of what Hyperstation is all about as well. It enables our present actions to have some sort of intelligibility. So this is Micronesian Navigation, which I think is a sort of imminent way to look at how we get through history. So very quickly, I'll turn now to the final aspect, which is acceleration, the idea of acceleration. And I want to return now to the distinction I made at the start between phenomenological time and historical time. So phenomenologically, again, it seems like our world is rapidly speeding up. We're changing jobs more and more quickly. The truths of the world are constantly changing. The knowledge that we need to make sense of the world is constantly changing. So phenomenologically, it seems like our world is already accelerating and speeding up. But, as I've tried to argue, historically, in historical time, we're actually in a moment of eternal present. It's a static historical time. So when I talk about acceleration, when I talk about what it means to accelerate, it's not the acceleration of phenomenological time. This would be quite a sort of perverse way of thinking about acceleration. Instead, acceleration is effectively the acceleration of historical time, breaking out of the stasis of capitalist accumulation, breaking out of the cycle of M to C to M prime. So this is what, very loosely, is indexed by acceleration. So with that, let me conclude by saying capitalist temporality, the sort of time that we exist in today, is a brain-dead repetition of capitalist accumulation. And I think the post-capitalist temporality, to think the future today, involves these three aspects. So one is the acceleration of historical time. Second, an imminent perspective, or an imminent navigation of history to replace the transcendent perspective. And then finally, thinking the future as a hyperstational force to replace the dogma of historical necessity. And I think these are the three minimal conditions for thinking the future today. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
I'm guessing there's probably a lot of questions, but I'll start with a quick one, and it will be quick. And it's slightly nutty. What's the... Carl, could you put off that mic? Yes. What's the shape of this post-capitalist time? So pre-modern is as a spiral. We can imagine the time of modernism to be a straight line, like the progress notion. I think that might be you. Yeah. So we can imagine progress to be a straight line, to get from here to there. And you can imagine postmodern time to be a loop. So MCM prime, which is saying it's like the paradigm for postmodern temporality, or capitalist temporality. You start at M, you go through a process, but you end up back at another version of M. And so the eternal present, there's change, and of course time is ticking on. But you kind of always come back to another version of the present or another version of M. So there's a kind of like a micro loop in that, which seems a different kind of loop to the one of Terminator. I was wondering if you had an idea of like a shape for... It's a totally nutty question and not at all...
No, it's a really good question. Yeah, I hadn't really given it much thought, but sort of off the cuff, I mean, maybe a sort of topological shape, and the idea that like, basically it's constantly mutating. There is no sort of fixed shape for what it is. Again, a sort of response to there's no transcendent perspective. It's entirely immanent, and it's constantly sort of adapting and changing in the flux of history itself. And the end point itself is constantly receding over the horizon. Yeah, I don't think there's any easy answer to it. I mean, the Terminator diagram is maybe the best sort of representation.
That's reassuring. Can I just tell Nick the structure? So because of problems with people hearing, I paraphrase the question.
Okay. Yeah.
Just to comment on the question, in the Hutchins account of the Micronesian Navigation, there was one thing that struck me in terms of the shape of that. It was that, so apparently so the Western navigation sees from above the boat moving from point A to point B, right? Yeah. And they see themselves as actually staying still, and all the islands come towards them. Yeah. Right? So that's kind of a very different space.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was around in the account of Micronesian navigation. If you look from above, or from our perspective, or our worldview, I guess, we would imagine going from point A to point B, whereas the local account is that they're standing still and the world moves past them. So it's more about just changing direction as things move past you. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many fascinating aspects of the way that they navigate. Yeah, this is another one of the really interesting things about it, yeah.
That's not really an answer. Okay, any more? There's one there.
Hi. You talked about the topological shape of Hyperstation, but the topological or formless shape is often one that's ascribed to capitalism, for example, in Deleuze and postscript on controlled societies. To what extent would you say a Hyperstation future is a inversion of controlled society in terms of this topological shape?
Okay, he's getting some tough questions tonight. So the question was, whether the hyperstation future is an inversion of control societies, of the topological. Could you just explain why control societies?
Control societies are often taken as regulatory and sort of in constant flux, in response to pressures, and in the way that capital constantly reconstitutes itself into new forms. Hartman Grier's Empire as well as in Deleuze's postscript on control society.
Okay.
So I wonder whether the sort of topological shape of hyperstation that you're bringing to it is it sort of is it a repetition of control capitalism, or is it sort of a inverted model of control capitalism?
Okay, so the point is, or the question is, control societies, as Deleuze describes them, are a form of power which is not fixed and determined, but mutable and adaptable according to different conditions and what individuals are doing. So it's not like a grid mechanism, but more a kind of network mechanism. So the question to Nick is whether the hyperstitional model is a kind of inverted form of this adaptable type of power.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I don't want to hold to this topological idea. I sort of just responded on the off the cuff there. But I think you're absolutely right. This sort of points to one of the limits of, say, a topological idea would be that, well, the fundamental shape itself stays the same throughout all the variations. I think probably better describes capitalism in that way. The fundamental repetition of the same structure, regardless of all the variations it goes through. Sort of superficial appearance of all this different variation, but fundamentally the same. So maybe the topological structure better describes capitalism than sort of post-capitalism. I think you're probably right.
That was a very clear presentation. I just wonder about perhaps throwing in a complication in the name of Walter Benjamin, because what he was critiquing really was the idea of time as a continuum, which he associated with reform and social democracy. So the eternal present would not exclude the idea of a past and a future, but the past would be the past of the present, which is historicism, and the future would be the future of the present, which is a sort of reformist future. So the point then is how to think the future in terms of, not in terms of temporal continuum, but in terms of some kind of discontinuity, which might be something like the dialectical image or revolution. Now, if you were to do it in relation to your schema, I guess that would have something to do with hyperstation and the relation of hyperstation to acceleration. Now, it seems to me hyperstation was also a thinking of fiction. And the relation to the present in terms of from the standpoint of a kind of fictional future such that that future will have real effects. And I just wondered, whether that makes sense in terms of your schema, how much you depend on the idea of time as a continuum, and what difference introducing fiction in relation to hyperstation would make.
Okay, that was quite a long question. Did people hear it? Yeah. Okay, so so it started as a defense of Benjamin, which was Benjamin's criticism was against notion of linear time and continuous time.
Yeah.
So what Benjamin puts forward is a disruption in time as a way to make the future absolutely distinct from the past. Right? So it's not like the future is a modification of the present or the past, but there's a sharp break, which is the revolution, or kind of messianic time, which completely transforms historical conditions in a time relation. And then the second part so there's partly where does the postcapitalist temporality stand in relationship to that revised notion of Benjamin in time. And then the second part was to put that into relation with hyperstation, where hyperstation is a fiction of the future, which is a kind of distinct futurity a distinct future and content to the present, and whether that's a sort of...
But with real effects.
With real effects, yeah, with real effects. So it's a kind of transformative narrative of transformative fiction, which changes the present, and whether that's a form of disruptive intervention in terms of time flow.
Yeah, let me sort of answer it a bit obliquely, but I think hyperstation on itself can be entirely sort of commensurate with a continuous idea of history. So let me contrast myself with somebody like Nick Land. I think his idea of hyperstation effectively is entirely commensurate with the continuation and acceleration of capitalism. Is fundamentally premised upon that. There is no rupture for him. It's just a matter of accelerating what he thinks is the fundamental sort of motor of history, which is already here, existing, operating. There's no disruption whatsoever. So I think hyperstation on itself can play into that continuous notion of history. I think at least acceleration, as I try to put forth, necessarily involves rupture, because we do live in a cycle of capitalist accumulation. To break out of it necessarily involves a rupture with that, some sort of disjuncture in history. And this doesn't necessarily equate to political revolution. I think sort of traditional ideas of revolution have to be given up on. But it does involve a disjuncture in history, which isn't sort of commensurate with what exists at the present moment. So hyperstation alone can go both ways. It's the additional aspect of acceleration which demands a rupture.
Could you just say a word why you think we should give up on revolution?
Yeah, okay, so I mean traditional ideas of revolution.
By the by.
Yeah. Traditional ideas of revolution, the classic sort of model being something like the Bolshevik Revolution, some sort of organized group of workers coming to power, taking over the state, transforming social relations, getting rid of capitalists, and then eventually bringing about full communism. I don't think that this is possible or desirable today, for a number of different reasons. We can maybe go into that, but two reasons. One, I think, state power is far too concentrated, far too powerful to actually allow something like that to happen. You also can't have socialism in one country. And the other aspect is the workers' movement as it exists and as it seems likely to exist in the next few decades has no power to do such a thing. If we're going to think about transforming the world, it has to be some other form of revolution, not the traditional idea of revolution.
How about fiction? You haven't answered.
The fiction one.
Because I think Nick Land associates hyperstation with fiction. We seem to be seeing more and more sort of philosophical fiction and references to science fiction, weird fiction in the context of speculation. So I wondered if that was relevant to temporality.
I mean, I think the fictional element plays into the utopian aspect. So the utopian thing is basically to say, well, so for instance, let me give an example from our book, the idea of universal basic income. And we argue for universal basic income, which isn't like, a couple £1,000 a year. We argue for a universal basic income, which really stretches beyond what's actually possible at the present moment.
You might want to describe what that is.
Okay, yeah. So universal basic income, for people who don't know, is basically the state giving everybody a certain livable amount of money, no questions asked. So it doesn't matter if you've been searching for a job. It doesn't matter if you just had drugs before you came and got your money. It doesn't matter at all. You get money, no questions asked, enough to survive upon, so that you don't actually have to work anymore. You can choose to work if you want to, or you can choose to, live off of this money and survive. So the idea is getting discussed a fair amount nowadays. The Labour Party in the UK is actually starting to pick up on it. But mostly when people talk about it today, it's as a sort of minimal amount that you wouldn't be able to survive upon. It would give you some sort of money to live off of, but not enough to actually survive in London. So you'd still have to go find a job and all these sorts of problems. In our book, we argue for a basic income that is actually survivable. I don't know what the precise number would be, but enough money to be able to live off of without having to actually go and find a job if you didn't want to. So this is the utopian aspect, which utopia is fundamentally a sort of fictional element. It's trying to make a future which seems implausible, not real, to make it real, to make it an active force. And this is what I think is the really sort of interesting aspect about utopias and about hyperstation, as compared to something like Derrida's idea of the future, is that there is necessarily this utopian element and a minimal content to it.
Okay, I saw 2 more questions, which we'll take 3. I'll take these 3 individually, and then we'll just do a wrap up at the end because we're coming up to 7. So you first.
Hi. I'm wondering about like agency when you talk about demanding, right? Because I guess I feel like a lot of the imagery you use, I've seen you speak a couple of times, and particularly today, a lot of the imagery you used was really Deleuzian, really of this topological kind of intersecting, tangential stuff coming together, all these kind of things. Like the shapes I was thinking of was when he speaks in Leibniz in the Fold, this kind of looping image, he starts to draw these lines, and he really trying to attempt at this shape. Anyway, it was kind of a lot more like that than the ways I've seen you speak before. I guess then I wonder, even with this kind of like navigational approach, you know, there are signs or this kind of like an alignment as a sign, and then you like act on that sign, which again makes me think of kind of like deterritorialization and reterritorialization and recuperation of any tactic you might try and create. So then, I mean, where does demanding come in there, right? Because in a way, everything you've spoken about is like an alignment happens and you act on that alignment, like when the stars align or something like that, right? And that's your sign to act.
Okay,
which is
I'm going
great.
to...
But then there's this demanding aspect.
Okay, all right, got it. Okay, so the question is basically, what kind of agency you're talking about, because you seem to be a closet Deleuzian.
Well, I'll come out of the closet. I am a Deleuzian. Yeah.
I'm proud.
Yeah. No, I did my master's thesis on Deleuze and everything, so I spent years and years thinking through him and with him. And
I'll buy you a drink after.
what was that?
I'll buy you a drink after.
Yeah. So I am a Deleuzian. Deleuze is a major sort of influence on me. Yeah, and I think actually returning to the Fold, the book, would actually be quite interesting to do. It's been years since I've looked at it, but I think you're absolutely right that it would be quite useful to think through these things. Now, in terms of agency, and particularly demands, I sort of conceptualize demands as being pointing towards the horizon, which is to say, well, again, if you're sort of in the midst of the ocean, you don't see the end point. You don't see it, but you can sort of demand yourself where you want to go without being able to see exactly what the end point looks like or anything like that. Demands sort of function in that way. Now, there's a question of, well, agency, I think, is a question of who demands. I think necessarily is collective. And I think this is maybe where Deleuze goes wrong, or at least where interpreters of Deleuze go wrong, is that it often gets played up in sort of micropolitics, much more about sort of individual escapes, sort of, you know, molecular escape from the molar. I think it has to be much more collective. You have to actually build a sort of powerful collective agency, which necessarily involves reterritorialization in certain ways. So I think the sort of idea that the only good thing is deterritorialization or decoding, I think that's wrong. It's useful, but it's not the only thing.
Also in the early chapters of...
Sorry, I've got to move on. Sorry. Okay.
Afterwards.
Yeah. Marcus, go ahead.
I actually happen to be from Finland, and I can confirm we are considering a trial of basic income next year. But in effect, we already have it. It's just that the phrasing is a bit different. Anyway, but I do have this question about the future of capitalism. Do you think that it's a necessity to have some sort of global meta-narrative that concerns everyone, or could we just cut off the people from the capitalistic system, let them do whatever they want, and then the capitalistic system can still remain, providing infrastructure? And also in this kind of a scenario, what do you think would be the balance of power, as in what entitles us as the receivers of the basic income to demand it from the capitalistic system in this case?
Okay, so the question is essentially whether there can be a sort of breakout from participating within capitalist sort of structures or processes, but nonetheless extracting basic income as a basis for that other kind of sector, I guess. And also, what would be the condition for making the demand for basic income upon capitalists?
Yeah, really good question. Whether or not people can sort of just be separated from capitalism and have it sort of exist on its own, I don't think so. I think the very function of capitalism, again, sort of MC to M prime, that M prime, the fact that you have to constantly get a surplus, means capitalism is constantly expanding. not only spatially, but it's constantly trying to find new markets, create new markets. And this is why any sort of counter project against capitalism has to take into account that expansive tendency. And it has to be pushing back against it. You can't just sort of try and build a space that's separate from capitalism, because eventually, inevitably, capitalism is going to try to take that space back. So this is, I don't think you can just separate people away from capitalism as a result of that.
Like the model there is the hippies and punk,
Yeah.
essentially. I mean, the hippies try to do that, but it's like the paradigm for where we are now.
I mean, Occupy is another good example. A lot of prefigurative politics, not all of it, but a lot of it is sort of premised upon this idea that, well, we just live like we want to live, and this will, I mean, I don't know. The logic sometimes is pretty weird, but it's made sometimes a matter of just like, this will inspire everybody and we'll all start to live just as we want to live, as though we could just step outside of capitalism. I think it's so thoroughly enmeshed within us, in terms of our desires, our interests, our subjectivities, that we can't just step outside of capitalism in any easy, simple way, unfortunately. Yep.
I was just thinking it might be possible that in case the production cost of keeping people alive is low enough, the capitalistic side might just keep the people happy in order not to cause a revolution or disturbance, just to keep it functioning. That might be like a reason for demand.
Yeah, I think you're right, but then you sort of look at when has capitalism done this? Social democratic era and post-war, which it took, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, World War II, the destruction of most of Europe, and the threat of communism as well, the threat of an actually existing communist force. Before capitalism said, maybe we should care about people. So I think the sort of conditions for that sort of thing are really difficult. And this is where it gets to your second question of how do we actually get these sorts of demands? And I think it's a classic argument of the left.
I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, not sure.
Maybe it's better if you just hold in your hand.
I'll do that.
Um,
A classic argument of the left that capitalism is going to get worse. I think it's very much true. I think if you look at every single trend within capitalism, in terms of demographics, in terms of productivity, in terms of growth rates, in terms of inequality, all of the trends point towards capitalism having intense problems over the next couple of decades. But I think actually this is going to lead to just people being immiserated. I think it's going to lead to worse and worse conditions for people unless people mobilize together, organize together. Now this is the big problem of the left, is what do you organize around? I don't think a worker's identity is sufficient to organize people anymore. I think we have to create new forms of collective identity to bring about some sort of collective power, new forms of organization able to do that. It's not easy, but that's what we have to do.
New images.
What's that?
New images.
New images of the future as well. So a direction. This is, the problem of Occupy is like, where do you actually want to go? Inequality is a problem. Okay, we can all agree on that, but like, where do you want to go? What is the alternative?
Okay, I'm going to take one last question for Nick to answer individually, and then we'll take a spate of them and we'll finish. So go ahead. Okay. You had a question?
My question's
Yeah.
been answered. So
Oh, okay. Any more? Okay, there's one.
Yeah, sorry, me again.
No, not you. The person behind you.
Oh!
You blew it.
Oh, it is actually me. Right?
Oh, it's you?
Oh, it is.
That's him.
I wanted to ask you about, I was going to give you some examples of what this could possibly be, which people would organise around outside of necessarily work and labour conditions, like perhaps it could be housing, which is related to care. And then care obviously moves outside of a different kind of temporality. And also at the start, like a lot of the examples that you were giving, the necessity of time and things like that, you didn't have the time to talk about queer temporality. Perhaps different ways. If I'm to think about something like care, like housing, for instance, or education, if people to centre around that, don't we also have to kind of look back, or perhaps demand accountability from those who are in charge before perhaps we move on further? how those would fit into your kind of post-capitalist temporalities, where you do have to look back to perhaps prevent future mistakes. Does that make sense?
Okay, so
And also get everyone on an even keel, because we clearly don't have that, which is one of the debates. And it's crass, but it is a critique.
all right. So just
Acceleration.
all right. So the question was, if you think about fundamental aspects of modern life, like education, care, and so on, do we not have to look back to historical models to try and understand what to do next with them?
Kind of. Yeah. You have to account for those different temporalities.
Oh yeah. So the temporalities of care, and education.
Care of all sorts of different things.
Okay.
Outside of
So is it something like there are different temporalities to different parts of social conditions, and how are they accommodated within a kind of like the meta temporality of the accelerationist movement, and also there's a question about accountability.
Yeah, so I think, I just critiqued the idea of sort of mobilizing around a worker's identity, particularly the sort of classic image of like an industrial factory worker. I think just holds no plausible sort of valence today. That being said, I think actually like social reproduction is probably one of the primary areas where if you're going to unite people around some sort of common identity, I think social reproduction, broadly speaking, is a really productive place to look. It's not my next book, but the book after that. I'm writing about exactly that sort of stuff. Because I do think it holds a lot of resources for, in terms of identity, so allowing people to see themselves as a collective, but then also in terms of leverage points about how do we interject into capitalism, into the capitalist valorization process in a way which compels people in power to actually change their ideas and their interests. I think social reproduction holds a lot of potential for that, so I think it's really important to look at. I don't know if this fully responds to your question, but it also does mean looking backwards, because you have plenty of examples of things like care strikes, sex strikes, and also unemployed movements, where people who don't have a workplace, that don't have any sort of worker identity, have still managed to exert a lot of power and influence over capitalism and win a lot of like political battles. And I think that looking at the history of these sorts of things, which there's sort of piecemeal histories of these things, but nobody's really looked at the entire history of social reproduction struggles, I think would be a really productive thing to do. So I broadly agree with what you said.
Okay, one question here.
I had a question about acceleration. So I wasn't quite sure what that meant. And it seems like you're just saying that it is breaking out of the stasis of the historical present of capitalism. So to me, that would mean, I would think that maybe acceleration is just starting to consider the future. But then, consider the future in what way? I'm assuming it's not along the lines of a modernist idea of progress.
Yeah.
I don't know if it relates to this idea of an abstract endpoint posited by this Melaunesian system. I mean, what would be the way that we would, because basically what is acceleration, and how do we think about the future with acceleration?
Okay, so the question is acceleration seems to be about breaking out of this condition of stasis, which is sort of not inactive, but this sort of looping perpetual presentness, and whether. Oh, okay. Okay. And whether can you just do the last bit again? Sorry, the area was distracting.
And whether acceleration means simply just starting to consider the future.
Oh, okay. So whether acceleration is just the fact of considering the future as different from the present.
As part of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on a sort of minimal level, yes, it is a matter of like reconsidering the future. I think because the sort of dominant sense amongst the left nowadays is that the future is over, or as Critchley puts it, it's a sort of capitalist mystification. Even thinking about the future is to give into capitalism already. And I think for all these sorts of reasons, as a minimal gesture, acceleration is saying, yes, we do need to think about the future. That being said, there's another aspect as well, which is that the classic sort of Marxist thesis was that capitalism is not something to be destroyed, but something to be sort of superseded. You build post-capitalism, you build communism on top of capitalism. And this is a sort of idea which again goes against a lot of the sort of leftist thinking nowadays, that technologies can't be repurposed, that it's fundamentally capitalist. We need to destroy the world, raise the ground before we can start thinking about what the future might be. Instead, acceleration is to say, well, we can build upon what we have, and that actually a lot of the productive potentials, the liberating potentials of the future are here, but constrained within capitalist accumulation. So those are sort of two aspects of what acceleration might mean.
Okay, I'm going to close with one question. And it's to go back to the angel of history. And you had a very good description about how, which I think typified postmodern time for you. And you had a very good description about how the angel of history, if you don't know the Benjamin allegory, is blown away by the blast of history, moves backwards. So it moves into the future, facing the past. But doesn't move towards the future. And it seemed to me this is actually, I never understood the angel of history as the angel of contemporary art. But it seems to me it's actually a very good description of the contemporary art condition, where we face the present and the past, and we progress in some sense, but without a sense of direction, and without a sense of what the future, we don't construct or head forcibly towards the future, but we're blown by the movement of time against history. So we don't repeat history, but we're also not ostensibly facing the future either, with a concerted way. So your notion of, as it comes out very well through the notion of navigation, it seemed to me that giving the future specific content is essentially to set up a bunch of principles of what we should do. And what that would suggest is, rather than this kind of angel contemporary art version or the contemporary art model, which is without progress, heads towards the future without an idea of what the future might be or what it should be or how we could construct it, what you would ask for. I realize you weren't speaking directly about art, just to move it back into this, towards this audience. What seems imperative then is to think about an art practice directed towards the construction and realization of principles, which I think are actually moral principles in the end.
I don't know about moral. I always sort of cringe at that. Ethical and moral. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I don't know. I know your stuff on contemporary art, and I know your critiques of it. And it seems quite plausible to put it in those terms. It does sort of remind me of the final question, which I didn't fully answer, but well, does it return to a sort of modernist idea of progress? And I think the modernist idea of progress was A, fixed, B, singular, and C, Eurocentric. It was entirely a parochial vision of what the future was, then imposed upon the rest of the world violently. And I think the sort of post-capitalist vision of the future can't be like that. It has to be constructed collectively, globally. And I think this also sort of distinguishes it from, say, sort of a decolonial future in like Walter Mignolo's work. A decolonial future is all about sort of plural civilizational forms constructing their own futures independently and existing virtually independently of each other. And I think that he really misses the condition that actually we exist within a globalized world, that any sort of future has to be global. It can't be a sort of regional matter of futures. It has to actually be thinking about how do we live collectively as a global entity nowadays. And this is sort of what I think post-capitalist future has to be. It can't be Eurocentric, it can't be regional based. It has to be global and collective.
Okay, before we stop, just one announcement. The seminars on Wednesday will now be, which are at 2:30? 2:30 on Wednesday, and I'll open to anyone who wants to go to them. There are two, one by Ramon, who's over there, and one by Catherine, who's over here. Those seminars will be around specific texts or images or something that we'll announce tomorrow through the MFA lectures via the news forum. Okay? So basically, you'll get a notice if you're signed up to that news forum, which will tell you what the discussion will be, and then you go along as you want on a week-by-week basis. And let's thank Nick for a great talk.